This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenwald, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and I'm joined as usual by my co-host Maura Donnelly. Welcome, Maura.
Hello, Charlie.
How's your summer been?
Wonderful. How about you?
Oh, good. Good, too. Thank you for asking. It's interesting that, goodness, we have a very important guest today. As time goes on, there is no lessening in the importance of jobs and a strong economy for the Commonwealth.
Absolutely.
And certainly one of the persons that's most key in this, of course, is always the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, if you will, and that is Gene Barr, and we're lucky enough to have him as a guest today on the show. Gene, welcome
Great to
the
be
show.
here. Thank you for the invitation.
Nice to have you. When I think of manufacturing, when I think of economic activity in Pennsylvania, I think of you and the Chamber. I think of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association and Fred Anton and Dave Taylor, and I think of the Pennsylvania Business Council and Dave Patti. I think those three organizations are key in the economic future of Pennsylvania. How do you interact with the other organizations, and what do you work on jointly, Gene?
You know, that's a great question. In fact, there's one other that's in there, which is NFIB, National Federation of Independent Business. And I said, in my view, there's a great collegiality among all of our organizations. We've kind of worked jointly on exactly those issues that you've described, particularly building Pennsylvania's economic prosperity for the future. And we all focus on the issues of taxes, labor issues, energy, transportation, and of course what we're going to talk a little bit about here today, which is healthcare. All of those are absolutely crucial, not only for Pennsylvania's economic growth, but for the benefit of its citizens. And as I mentioned, we work very cooperatively on all of those issues, trying to move things forward, and we do have a lot of work to do here in Pennsylvania.
We are going to spend a little bit of time on healthcare today. And did you know that only 15% of Americans are familiar with the Affordable Care Act?
Well, I'm not surprised because there's been so much uncertainty over it.
Right.
There's been delays in the deadlines.
But there seems to be an inundation of information. I think it's a little interesting that people are not focusing on this issue, and it's coming down the pike.
It's coming pretty quickly, although with the deadlines being pushed back, we're not quite sure on any given day exactly what we're going to be faced with when. But I think what people have heard, they're very uncertain about, which is, not a surprise because there's so much around us. I mean, we're taking on a huge chunk of the national economy when we talk about healthcare and trying to move that under more government control. I won't say under government control, because when you look at Medicare, Medicaid, the federal government has controlled a significant part of healthcare already, which I think is part of the issue that we have with this.
Well, as a business organization, what are you doing to get geared up for some of the approaching deadlines, and how are you helping businesses get ready for what is coming? We're not quite sure what, but there are some deadlines approaching.
There are, and that's a great question. And really, our approach to this is two-pronged. First off, as the state's largest broad-based business advocacy group, we work on public policy. And when this was implemented, we worked on this as well, and we had issues with it. I'll be completely honest with you. So we have worked on it. We'll continue to work on a public policy basis to try and make this law as good as it can. And if it gets repealed, as some people are talking about, we will work on that as well. The second piece that's our interest is that we also offer health care to our members. We always want to make sure that our members and their employees have access to affordable health care that's as affordable as possible and accessible. So we're looking at it both from the public policy side as well as from the more practical business side to see where this market is headed, what kinds of products we might be able to offer to our employees and to our members, and see where everything is headed.
Well, Pennsylvania opted out of creating a public exchange, correct?
That's correct.
But that doesn't preclude there being private exchanges created on a statewide basis. So employees are going to now have an option between a federal healthcare exchange and private exchanges in Pennsylvania?
Well, at this point, scheduled to be October 1st.
Yes. And
who knows what will happen. There will be a federal exchange in Pennsylvania. No one knows exactly what that will look like. No one knows who will staff it. There are issues over, to be quite honest, medical privacy concerns at this point that have come up recently. So we don't know what that exchange is going to look like. There are some other carriers who have opted and have made some indication that they intend on setting up their own exchange. Now, how will that look? The state insurance commissioner has said in the past that if it's only one carrier, you can't call it an exchange.
It's not an exchange. Well, it's not a marketplace. The whole idea is to create a marketplace.
Exactly,
right.
and to create some competition.
Right.
So where all that goes is kind of anybody's best guess at this point. I mean, there may be some people waiting and sitting back, looking at this October 1st, saying, well, we're going to wait and see what happens when the smoke clears from this to see how well they do, and maybe learn from that.
Yeah.
I mean, there may be some lessons to be gained by this federal implementation.
Jean, I wanted to, you made reference to the period of time before Obamacare was issued, that your organization was taking a look at these proposals.
We did.
And had positions. Could you tell us a little bit about that? How did your organization go about examining this proposed piece of legislation, and was proposed legislation which became law, and how did you work with your members to do that analysis?
Well, first, obviously, healthcare concerns are one of the biggest concerns that our members have had for years and years and years. It is an offering that many of our members make. To be quite blunt, not all of them can afford to offer healthcare options to their employees.
And there's no requirement that they have to.
And there's no requirement except for what comes in under Obamacare.
Right.
With the 50 employee prior to Obamacare, exactly. And to be quite blunt, most of our members are small business people who in many cases simply can't afford to do it. When this began to take off, and of course we had some experience with it because Governor Rendell, during his term here as governor, attempted to set up something along the lines of what Massachusetts has, which are requirements to buy, requirements to offer, et cetera. We worked with our counterparts at the U.S. Chamber as well as other state chamber offices, some of our colleagues, to talk a little bit about what we thought could work. And let's be honest, there are things that can work better in the healthcare side. One of the concerns we had with this provision, whether you want to call it Obamacare or the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act or the National Health Care Law, whatever words that you want to use, our concern was that it did not do anywhere near what it ought to in terms of controlling health care costs. If you don't control health care costs, someone's going to have to pay that bill. So we had focused on things such as being able to buy health insurance across state lines, which you can't do. We focused on more legal reform, because we know from talking to healthcare practitioners that they're very concerned about the practice of defensive medicine and tests that may or may not be necessary, that they want to cover themselves so that they don't have some plaintiff's lawyer say, well, why didn't you do that test for the person? So there were a number of things that we offered and that really weren't taken up before we took this, what we believe to be a drastic route of requiring employers to offer, requiring people to buy. Which is kind of where we're sitting now with Obamacare, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act.
Well, do you think any of these other cost-saving measures can be put into place, coincident with anything that might happen with the Affordable Care Act?
Well, we would certainly hope so. There was an interesting comment that was made when this was being implemented, and perhaps you probably recall, someone asked Howard Dean, who was, I believe, head of the DNC at the time, well, why isn't legal reform being offered as part of this? It seems like everybody's getting a little bit gored here, with the exception of the trial lawyers. And his answer was, well, quite frankly, we didn't want to take on the trial lawyers. It was a frank and probably an honest answer. Can we do it? I would hope so, but given the present political configuration at the national level, I doubt that would happen.
Well, I thought it was really interesting. I think it just started this week, a host of commercials on the radio by the unions opposed to the Affordable Care Act.
That is a great point to make, and so many unions, of course, a lot of unions have applied for waivers from this to start. There's currently a lot of discussion at the federal level about whether federal employees will come under the provisions or not, and a lot of the unions have seen the adverse impacts that Obamacare is bringing. For example, a lot of their members being forced to go from full-time to part-time, which brings the employer's complement under what's required and what would set them under Obamacare. So they're looking at this and seeing, to be honest, what we warned about, which is the huge adverse impact on employment here in this Commonwealth and in this country.
The supporters of the law say that they're not going to see that kind of change, that they won't be bumping employees down to part-time just to fall under the 50-employee threshold. What are you hearing from your members?
We've already seen that happen. We have already heard, for example, part of the act says that if you have 50 or more employees, you're required to provide health care at a certain level is to be determined by the federal government. I will tell you that we have heard from our members who have said, hey, I've got 45, 47 employees and I'm not hiring anymore. We had an economic summit earlier this year. We had Mark Zandi of Moody's Econometrics, and one of the questions that Mark was asked, what's your take on the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act? And while he said there are a lot of good provisions in it, he said, as somebody who watches the 21 to 49 employee segment every day, he said, without a doubt, it has had an adverse impact on employment. Now, I think as we're trying to get ourselves out of the greatest recession that we've had since the Great Depression, we had a critical path to make back a few years ago. We could choose to grow employment, or we could choose to implement this huge reworking of our healthcare system. And the president decided to go that route with a commensurate impact on employment. And I think we're seeing that now.
You've said that you've worked with the National Chamber.
Yes.
Wondered if you could share with us and our viewers what their activities have been in regard to working with the Obama administration on this. How much were they involved with the cobbling together of this legislation, and what are they trying to do right now, Gene, and particularly what are they trying to do in concert with the state affiliates?
Well, the U.S. Chamber, of course, at the time worked with us, as I mentioned, about trying to offer some alternatives to this. I guess we can see what impact that had. There might have been some that were taken in. I think that the U.S. Chamber working with us has had some real impacts. For example, one of the provisions that was in this law to start with was a requirement that small businesses take on significant reporting requirements to the IRS to make sure that they were covered under all of this. And one of those was that you had to send a 1099 to basically almost everybody that you did business with. Built into the cost projections for Obamacare were the fines and penalties that they knew would happen to businesses, because there was just no way you could completely comply with this. They counted on noncompliance in order to help fund Obamacare. So the U.S. Chamber, working with their counterparts, helped peel that provision back out of it, because it was finally seen as being so punitive to businesses, particularly small businesses, in terms of the record keeping, that was taken out. There was another provision called the Class Act, which was a long-term care that the U.S. Chamber and all of us said is unaffordable, flat out unaffordable. That was pulled back when Secretary Sebelius finally came out and said, yeah, we have to take this back. This isn't going to work. So there's been a lot of attention focused and a lot of light focused on those things that really drive the cost in this. Now, the problem, I think, is that this thing is, Obamacare is kind of being exposed for what it is, almost a financial house of cards. Well, if we get enough fines and penalties from businesses over here because we know they can't comply, if we do the Class Act where the money's front-loaded and we have to spend it in out years, we can count it up front. If we double count Medicare, Medicaid, if we cut reimbursements to doctors, this is what's all built into this to try and get to the number that says, here's how we pay for it.
Well, I hope that we can, with this show, increase the percentage of Pennsylvanians who are aware of the Affordable Care Act, and maybe they'll do a little bit more research on it. But as we close out here, I just want to give you an opportunity to tell us all about the Pennsylvania Chamber Dinner, the largest gathering of business leaders from across the state coming up here. You want to tell us a little bit about that as we
Absolutely.
close
We're
out?
going to have probably 1,500 or more guests. We've had a great run at the Pennsylvania Chamber with this. It's one of the more noted events in Harrisburg and throughout the Commonwealth, gathering for government leaders, political leaders, business leaders from across Pennsylvania. This year is Dennis Miller, the former comedian. Yeah. Well, I guess he still is a comedian. He's a former comedian. He still is a comedian.
Is that what happened to his
he's funny.
affiliation?
Former SNL guy,
Yeah.
former Monday Night Football, and he'll be there. I think he's on Fox. He does some commentary on Fox. In the past few years, we've had former President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell. It's just a string of really great speakers that we've had, and people tell us how much they enjoy the Chamber Dinner, and we're certain it's going to be another great evening. So
The date?
The date is September 23rd, I believe. I'll probably have that one wrong, but I believe it's the 23rd.
Good.
Okay.
It's whatever the Monday is.
Yeah.
Well, we wish you the best of success with the
Thank you.
dinner, and I'm sure that his affiliation with Bill O'Reilly hasn't made him a former comedian.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
But yeah, I still find him funny too, and good luck with the dinner, and thank you so much for being with us today,
Absolutely.
Gene.
Glad to do it. Thanks.
We'll be right back with the second segment of Behind the Headlines right after this.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive. creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Underwriters of America, a better way for truck insurance, and by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
Hi, welcome back to the second segment of Behind the Headlines. And Maura and I are very fortunate in this segment. Now, we had Gene Barr in the first segment from the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. And with this particular segment, we're going to have Dave Patti back. Dave is the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Business Council. Well, welcome very much. Thank you for coming back and visiting with us. We wanted to have you look into your crystal ball. We've had fish bowls here with you before, but we haven't had crystal balls. And we'd like you to look into your crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen when the legislature returns and in this autumn.
It's not seasonally appropriate, but I don't know that it's so much crystal ball. I feel more like the third ghost in A Christmas Carol. You're
getting ahead of the seasons here.
The ghoul that comes in with no face and just says, if nothing changes, the shadows I foretell don't bode well for you. And I don't know that anything is going to happen, frankly. I mean, if you think of what we left with, it was sort of the big three was the talk. Pension reform, liquor privatization,
and transportation infrastructure
I'm
financing.
not convinced that the General Assembly has any interest in doing any of the above. Not to say there aren't some members who want to do one or two or even three.
Dave, many of our viewers don't understand this. You have the Republican Party controlling the governorship, the Senate, and the House.
Control being a word you may want to define.
One would think that perhaps that there would be enough collaboration, enough communication there that something would be done on any of these three.
Yeah, one would think. I mean, in fairness to all the players, and there are institutional differences between the executive branch and the General Assembly, no matter what the political party is. There are differences within caucuses that are ideologically based. But when I say, the shadows I see, nothing will happen, I mean, I think it really means the voters have got to pick up the phone, call their members of the General Assembly, and tell them. Because I will tell you that I'm talking to House Republicans and their leadership who tell me they hear nothing from anybody who really truly cares about transportation. Now, Terry Madonna has a poll out this week that says, according to the people he surveyed, 29% said we ought to do something about transportation. The Senate did a great job last year on transportation. 45-0 passed a bill, went nowhere with the House. I'm sorry, 45-5, not 45-0, but an overwhelming majority approved transportation, and something we very much care about. Mm-hmm. People on the House side would probably counter that they did something historic by passing a liquor bill that the Senate didn't really take up. And then there's that whole thing about are they linked or whatever else. But I don't know of anything that's happened over the summer since we changed that changes that dynamic, that the Senate is very interested in transportation, as are some members of the House, don't get me wrong. And that the House Republicans, anyway, are very interested in liquor, as are some members in the Senate. But I don't know that there is enough magic there to pass either one through both chambers, let alone, in a form that the other chamber would find acceptable.
Well, but aren't we playing with fire by not doing it? Let's take transportation and privatization out of it. I mean, doesn't something have to be done on the pension? I mean, is there a way to turn a blind eye to it?
We have kicked that can down the road for years and years and years, to use that overused metaphor that everyone's using in D.C. and Harrisburg these days. Pension liability is eating the rest of the budget. So whatever else you think we could do, I mean, some of the conservatives in the House who don't like transportation have said, well, let's just repurpose money we have. Well, the fact of the matter is that there's very little discretionary money in either the federal budget or the state budget, and that the amount we spend to maintain the pensions and the debt that we have, the unfunded liability that we have on pensions, is growing by hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So for those people who think that we're not funding education adequately enough, who would think $300, $400, $500 million more in education would make a big difference, that's how much we're growing per year in what we owe for pensions. If you want to repurpose money for transportation, That's how, that would be a good start. One of the problems in transportation is we actually pay almost $600 million, or I think it's now over $600 million out of the general fund, out of the motor license fund to pay for the state police, rather than take that $600 million out of the general fund. Well, you know what? If we weren't paying as much for the pensions, there would be money to pay for the state police completely out of the general fund. It doesn't take care of the entire $3 billion problem, don't get me wrong, but there's 20% of it.
There's money to be found if
so
it's dealt with.
I mean, it's, the pensions are whatever else you'd rather do, or frankly, I think a lot of people would say, hey, how about just a tax cut? That would be a good thing to do with $600 million or so too, but we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars this coming year, billions of dollars in the future year, above the money we're already putting in, but billions of dollars per year just to pay for the pension. So you're right in terms of that. It's the ticking time bomb, and it doesn't get smaller by waiting.
And we see very recently Brad Mallory, a deputy secretary in the administration, was testifying that, again, something must be done regarding the turnpike situation. Of course, Act 44 didn't happen. We've never been able to toll Route 80, so we don't have those revenues coming in. So transportation financing has, to a great extent, fallen on the back of the turnpike. And don't our legislators realize that this is unsustainable over the long term, Dave?
I can't speak to what they realize or don't realize. I mean, you would think they do. And again, I mean, trying to be fair, I guess, realizing it and then figuring out what the solution is, and then finding the political will to enact the solution, are, all different parts of this puzzle. To explain that issue, or remind the viewers of that issue, what we did was floated bonds in anticipation of the ability to derive revenue by tolling I-80, and to pay off the bonds. Well, we floated the bonds. We used the bonds to do transportation improvements and maintenance. But we don't have the revenue source. So what we're doing is paying that off by continuing to raise the rates on the turnpike for the tolls by some, I think 30% again last year. So for those of us like myself who drive the turnpike, I do 80 miles a day on the turnpike on a normal day, and hundreds someday. For all of the people who use that corridor along southeastern Pennsylvania, where frankly we have more of the population, and the northeast extension, and then across the state, and the trucks that do that, they are shouldering that burden, as you say. I mean, frankly, those who drive Route 80, whether they be in-state or out-state, are getting it pretty much, free. That's a problem, but that exacerbates the other problem, which the governor has been pointing to, which is we know that our maintenance, not building new capacity, not expanding our roads, not getting rid of the congestion, but our just pure maintenance of what the status quo is underfunded by $3 billion a year. And what you are seeing, what's also happening, and that everyone will get to enjoy this coming Labor Day weekend, is detours, weight restrictions, big delays because trucks are on back roads because they're no longer allowed to go over bridges.
Do you want to talk for a second, if I may interject, about the weight restrictions and bridges and some of the changes that have occurred over the summer?
Well, and what it is that's a backdoor tax increase in the business community. I'm going to tell you. I mean, what the General Assembly did by doing nothing was raised our taxes because they're raising our cost of doing business. So I mean, this was a bad summer for the business community. The General Assembly continued the capital stock and franchise tax, and refused to do something on business, so that's or on infrastructure. So the businesses, whether it be trucks, getting raw materials in, product out, getting employees safely to work, and home again in the evening. Where you used to be go out and back, twice in a day with the same truck. Well, now if it takes 6 or 7 hours, you have to put a second truck on. Where you have weight restrictions, you have delays and detours that take more fuel, longer driver hours. So it has gotten to a point where it is a cost of doing business, and frankly, it's going to be a reason that businesses are going to think twice about expanding in Pennsylvania or looking to come here.
So rather than simply repairing the bridges, we simply lowered the amount of weight that could pass on that bridge, so we can hopefully get more life out of that bridge and avoid some kind of
and when I say business, I mean,
this
is not just, we're not just talking about people hauling steel or concrete or something like that. One of the biggest users of bridges in Pennsylvania, and one of the biggest problems with weight, is actually from our dairy industry. So for everybody who wants to say our number one industry is agriculture, our dairy farmers can't get the milk off the farms. not without taking it in trucks.
Yeah.
They actually would like to follow what has happened in other states where the trucks have been increased in size to increase the efficiency, lower the cost of delivering milk to the processing plants and then ultimately to the consumers. Not only can we not allow the bigger milk trucks in Pennsylvania, we're soon not going to be able to allow the current milk trucks over a lot of bridges. The weight of that, water is 7.5 pounds per gallon. I forget what the density of milk is, but it makes it weigh even more. You have a lot of weight in those big tank trucks. Think about moving the water around for the Marcellus shale industry. A lot of weight in those water trucks. So we could unlock energy and have a better economy. We can keep growing our dairy economy. We can keep helping our manufacturing economy. But if the bridges have weight restrictions, it doesn't work.
Well, so you predict little to no
gloom and
action
doom.
on what is going to happen? Anything?
I really do think that what has to happen is voters have to, and if you look at polling, they're not happy with anybody, whether it be the General Assembly or the governor. They have to express themselves to members of the General Assembly. People hear from the extremes, whether it be right or left. Right. They hear from the people who don't want to raise taxes under any circumstances. They hear people who never saw a tax increase they didn't like. What they need to hear is from the middle that says, look, within reason here. I don't want my taxes to go up tremendously, but I understand the value of me paying a little more at the pump if I'm going to have safe bridges for the school buses that take my children to school in the morning, if I'm going to have bridges that allow our economy to keep functioning. I'm willing to pay for that. I need you to take some action on transportation. Maybe I want you to take action on liquor privatization. To understand, hey, I don't blame the teachers, the government workers, those in the public sector, or begrudge them their pensions. But on the other hand, while keeping them as whole as we can, we've got to do something here to get cost under control going forward in the future. And it's time for people to express themselves to their lawmakers directly.
Okay. In the last 15 seconds, 2014 gubernatorial election. Any thoughts?
I'll boldly predict that Tom Corbett will be the Republican nominee. And I think that the polls belie the fact that it's in the early days. It's easy to say the incumbent's in trouble. I think that it'll be a very competitive race, and I think that
and history on our side.
Still the governor's, his re-election chances are very good.
What do you think of Jack Wagner getting in the race?
I don't think he'll do it.
Okay. All right. We're out of time. We want to thank you, Dave, for joining us, and we want to thank you at home for joining Mara and I again. We ask you to join us again next week, and you can catch this show again on our archive at voiceofpa.net and on YouTube. We'll see you next week.